Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. So, under the pretense of maybe, possibly, Season of Discovery going into a Classic Plus direction, recently I did a video going over some of the secret cut content from Vanilla WoW that could be contenders. Some people think that the most classic that you could possibly get would be content that the original developers planned, and thanks to some helpful people in the comments, it turns out there's much more that I missed, so I wanted to do a follow-up video here. First, starting with Ulduar. Ulduar is a facility constructed by the Titans, which are the godlike creators of Azeroth, as a prison for one of the old gods, the king of BJs, Yogg-Saron. The Titans wanted to shape and order the world, sort of, and the old gods opposed them and sought to corrupt it, and eventually the Titans gained the upper hand and started imprisoning the old gods, and Ulduar was created to house Yogg-Saron. So eventually players would of course visit this in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, but believe it or not, it was planned to be in Vanilla World of Warcraft. In fact, it was to be its own entire continent south of Kalimdor. What you're looking at is a concept map all the way back during the game's initial development in 1999. Also funny to note that Kalimdor itself was way smaller, a fraction of the size of the Eastern Kingdoms. So interesting that Cthulhu maybe wouldn't have been the only old god that players would encounter in Vanilla. No one can agree on what Classic Plus is, but what I often see are new zones. In the last ones we talked about some unfinished ones here and there, such as Hyjal, Uldum, Kolthalas, and these would eventually be fleshed out in later expansions, and as with Ulduar, but only as an enclosed raid, not a continent, so I think this could have some potential. Really, as far as they got was just this map. They never made the terrain for the zone or any modeling or anything, but it was planned. In the last video, we talked about the mostly abandoned Ashara zone. There's a cut MOBA battleground there, as well as an abandoned dungeon, and somehow I missed the biggest one, and that's the Timbermaw Gate. In the northwestern area of the zone, you'll find a bunch of furbolgs wandering about, and tucked away in the corner is a very large and imposing gate that looks like it was meant to be something. There are a couple of theories as to what. First is another dungeon, Ashara, because the developers realized that a zone that's essentially a giant cliff is really annoying to navigate, was kind of abandoned, and the whole area is ripe for unfinished content, as mentioned earlier, so some theorize that this was intended to be a furbolg dungeon, or maybe possibly even a raid. The other theory, and this one is more interesting I think, is that this was thought to be the fourth entrance to the Timbermaw Hold, which you may know as the series of tunnels connecting Moonglade, Fellwood, and Winterspring together. Inside the tunnel, you can sort of find this out-of-place wall, possibly indicating a quick patch job once the idea was scrapped. And this is where it gets really interesting. Looking at the world map, if this tunnel was indeed connected to Ashara, which is pretty far, it would go right under one of the largest pieces of cut content in Vanilla, the zone that we mentioned in the first episode, Mount Hyjal. Now Hyjal does have a blocked entrance at the end of that elite demon infested area in Winterspring, where people used to farm for the Eye of Shadow. But as some of you know, when it was finished in Cataclysm, it had those Barrow Den tunnels as part of some quests, so I wonder if maybe the original plan was to connect Ashara here, and halfway between it, it could connect to Mount Hyjal and maybe serve as an alternate entrance where, if you took the time to grind out reputation with the Timbermaw, you could gain safe passage instead of going through this gauntlet of elite demons. If Classic Plus were to ever be a thing, and they were to implement Hyjal, I think this connecting area, as described, would be a really cool addition, and sort of knock out two pieces of cut content at once. And next, we have the Dalaran bubble in the Alterac Mountains. Dalaran is known as the City of Mages. It was founded after the War of the Ancients during the early days of human civilization, and it became the center for all of the mages in Azeroth, sort of like the Citadel from Game of Thrones, with the Kirin Tor essentially being the maesters. They remained neutral throughout the various conflicts within the world until the Second War, where they rightfully and understandably aided the Alliance against Horde Filth, and during the Third War it was attacked directly by Arthas, who summoned Archimonde inside of it, leading to its destruction. Lore-wise in Vanilla, it's being rebuilt, and of course it wouldn't be until Wrath of the Lich King that it would be converted into a floating city, and it would make its way to Northrend and serve as the main hub for that expansion. and then later the same for Legion. I think that the existing major cities of vanilla are a really big part of its identity, so I wouldn't say this being a hub would be the greatest idea, but if we're talking new raid content post Naxxramas, this could be a contender, I think. Like maybe Archimond forgot his anime pillow or something, and he comes back for it, and it gets taken over by the Legion. We could have a demon raid, something that vanilla didn't have. Kind of a tangent here, but speaking of cut content and giant pink bubbles protecting cities, in the Warlords of Draenor expansion, you might remember that Shatrath City had the same giant bubble protecting it, and it was surrounded by an army of elite demons. This ended up being Draenor's missing raid, as evidenced by this early screenshot. So, Draenor today has the reputation of being one of the weaker expansions for WoW for many reasons, one of them being the fact that there were just 3 raids. Blizzard sort of half-jokingly stated for many years that in order to implement player housing, they would have to sacrifice a raid tier, so some think that the garrisons in Draenor was the reason for this, and in fact if you go to the graveyard in the garrison, you'll find a marker labeled Raid D tier. Yeah, like I said, kind of a tangent, but kind of funny that there are 2 instances of unfinished content involving cities sheltered by pink bubbles. And speaking of cities, next we have one of the most legendary unfinished areas of vanilla. I can't believe I didn't mention this in the last one, but that's Old Ironforge. So this isn't to be confused with Alpha Ironforge, which is essentially the same as the one we're accustomed to, but with 2 separate levels. Unlike many other things in this list, this wasn't scrapped due to time constraints, but instead from feedback that it was just too confusing and difficult to navigate, which eventually led to them downsizing it to 1 level. But they did leave behind an artifact from this Alpha Ironforge. In the King's Room, you may have noticed a conspicuous gate off to the left side. Behind these gates lies a big secret, and there were a few methods of getting into it. The one that I remember is that at a certain point in the game's history, for some reason you could initiate a duel right here next to the mailbox near the bank, and if you started it and you made a beeline all the way around to King Magni's room, you could reset the expiration timer by going near his throne, and then you would have one player stand near the door, and you would either sheep or fear them so they get forced through, and what they would find would be an abandoned tunnel system leading to the core of Ironforge, this remnant of the original Alpha. And this is one of the ultimate secret hidden areas in the game that players would glitch through. Going up the stairs, you have this sort of ritual area, and taking a right at the fork, it sort of loops around, and you have this precarious climb along some ridges overhanging a pit of lava. As players would eventually find, this area would be finished in the Cataclysm expansion, where Magni is crystallized due to a curse, until the Battle of Azeroth, where he starts performing sexual favors for an addictive drug called Azerite.
Champion, I can sense Azerite nearby.
In the last episode, we went over some areas that would eventually be finished in the first expansion, the Burning Crusade, such as Karazhan or Kolthalas, but there's much more. In fact, all of the Outland was planned to be in vanilla, and it was just later pushed back to the Burning Crusade, again due to the time constraints. But what you're looking at here is the original Hellfire Peninsula, which is as far as they made it. It's pretty recognizable, but at the same time different. Here's what the original Dark Portal looked like before they actually added stairs. Here's Honor Hold, Zethgor. The area overall seems to be much more open, and there are more lingering signs of life compared to its Burning Crusade counterpart. You may recognize the reuse of the giant mushrooms from the Eastern Plaguelands. The Pools of Agonar are also still present, although his remains are much smaller compared to the final release. And off the map, past a void, can be found some Silithid hides, like what would you find in Silithus, and even some ruins from Tanarus. The zone overall was absolutely huge, and it must have been a really big blow to put so much into it for it to ultimately never see the light of day. Similarly, we also have what people refer to as Old Outland. This is a much smaller entry, and of all places, you'll actually find it in the Dead Mines. By clipping through the wall in the beginning and doing some tricky floating aimed just right, you land on target to a pretty large mass of land, but with really only one thing going on at the center here, with a collection of some of the floating trees that were also found in the old Hellfire Peninsula hovering over this void chasm. So this is clearly just a bit of experimenting by the developers back in the day. that didn't really amount to too much, but it became one of the more iconic hidden areas for explorers willing to boundary break. Not really sure for its potential in Classic Plus, but just a cool area that I thought was worth mentioning. But zones weren't the only thing that were pushed back. In fact, as far as pre-alpha, it was planned that players would be able to level from 1 to 70 in vanilla through those missing zones, and one of them was going to be the Dragon Isles. So in the latest expansion, Dragonflight, players have begun to explore the finished version of these isles, but as evidenced by this early development screenshot, they were supposed to be in the game in 2004. In fact, there even exists a map. As for why it was abandoned, as John Statz described in his book, The Warcraft Diary, it just didn't really make sense in the lore since the dragons are mostly good. You have Alex Straza as the Red Ranger, Ysera as the Green, Malagos the Blue, Nazdormu for Yellow. Did you know that the Power Rangers was 2 shows spliced together? The action portion was actually a Japanese program called Super Sentai, and then the teenage drama portion was filmed to give them backstories and personalities. Anyways, the point being here, the villain Dragonflight at the time was Deathwing, and the Black Dragonflight, whom players had encounters with via the Onyxia and Nefarian fights. So having an entire continent with just one Dragonflight as an enemy felt like it would be too repetitive for players. Shoutouts to the Warlords of Draenor, by the way. And probably due to time constraints, the whole thing was scrapped until, as it turns out, 2022 with the Dragonflight expansion. They did get as far as some model and terrain work for the zone, with some completely unique buildings that never made it into the game, curiously enough. And as evidenced by the screenshot, there's even to be a raid here. I can only imagine that this giant palace would have been it. It's actually an absolutely enormous zone, so again, it must have been a pretty big blow to put all of this work into it, only ending up having to scrap it. But that's about it for this episode. Thanks for letting me be your tour guide. If you have more stuff that you think is worthy for coverage, feel free to leave it in the comments. But I think between these 2 episodes that I put out recently, if SOD were to ever go down a Classic Plus route, which who knows if it'll happen, I think it's safe to say that there's no shortage of content that was planned by the original developers that they can tap into. But even if none of that happens, I hope you at least found the video interesting. I think exploration is honestly sort of a lost art in today's goal-oriented player base, and I kind of feel like doing more stuff like this, so you can expect more videos similar to this in the future. We'll probably go expansion by expansion, and we'll look at everything that ended up on the cutting room floor. Regardless of all of that, like the video if you liked it, because I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.